The true story of Aunt Arlene is a tragically beautiful one. Imagine for a moment a woman giving birth to 24 children during her lifetime. Now imagine all 24 of those children dying before any of them ever reached their first birthday. Imagine the pain of a woman who was blamed by her community for killing them all. Prepare yourself for her incredible true story. Our story begins in the small mountain village of Lambsburg, Virginia, a remote area that is walled in by the mighty Blue Ridge Mountains in the north, along with Sugarloaf Mountain in the east and Fisher Peak in the west. The small valley nestled in the middle of these highlands was once known as Roxburgh because of all the boulders that frequently came crashing down from the heavens above. It was here that a little girl named Arlene Hawks was born in 1839 on a 400-acre farm along the banks of Stewart's Creek. One of 9 children, Arlene was your typical mountain girl who helped her mother tend to the young ones, the cooking, cleaning, milking, tending to the chickens, and gathering vegetables from the garden while fetching wild berries and chestnuts from the forest. Arlene never attended school as a girl, since it was commonly accepted that there was no use educating gals, since all they would do is tend a house and have babies during their life. But despite her lack of formal education, Arlene was highly intelligent, and she possessed excellent judgment skills and common sense. And to be honest, those 2 traits alone were the most valuable that a mountaineer could have. Because of their isolation, much of the Hawks family's time was spent tending to the crops. They usually only made the 15-mile journey through Piper's Gap to the nearest town of Mount Airy, North Carolina, at harvest each year to sell their corn and apples in exchange for their yearly supply of sugar, salt, and other necessities. Outside of that yearly trip, the only chance Arlene had for socializing was down at the primitive Baptist church. Now, lots of folks don't realize it, but Church Day was a big event back in those days. Preparation for that service started before Sunday had even arrived. Women and girls would spend the entire day before baking pies and preparing food, while boys jockeyed for the right to walk the girl of their choice to and from church. The service itself was an all-day event with several preachers in attendance, a full day of fiery sermons about the perils of sin and the glory of the afterlife. One after another, each time a preacher's booming voice gave out, another would take its place with a brimstone and fire sermon. Yet for all that preaching, most folks came to church for socializing. Men folks shared the news and discussed the weather and crops, while the women caught up on all the local gossip. But for the boys and the girls, this was one of the few opportunities they had to mingle and even meet potential mates. For Arlene, this was where she first met a boy named John, who was one of the 15 Pucket children who lived 3 miles away on Renfro Ridge. Arlene and John quickly struck up a friendship, and the boy even began regularly walking the mountain girl to and from church. Twice a month, he was even allowed to come visit the Hawks' cabin, where Arlene and John were allowed to sit on the porch together, albeit under the watchful eye of Arlene's father. The years went by, and Arlene and John's feelings for one another grew stronger, and in the spring of 1860, 16-year-old Arlene Hawks married 22-year-old John Pucket. The two quickly moved into a one-room cabin at the base of Groundhog Mountain in Patrick County, Virginia, where they intended to start their new family. But it's here that this story takes a tragic turn that historians have debated to this very day. Storm clouds were brewing all across America with rumors of a coming war, and by 1861, those rumors became a reality when the Great War between the states erupted. John Pucket had the blood of the Over-Mountain men running through his veins, and he was one of the very first men in the entire county to volunteer to fight for the Confederate Army. In June of that year, John boarded the first train he had ever seen and was shipped off to battle, unaware that his new wife was pregnant. John's enthusiasm for the glory of going off to battle was quickly extinguished by the harsh realities of war. Right away, disease ran rampant through John's unit and killed several men. Then there was the lack of equipment and proper gear. Many men wore their boots out in the first few weeks of marching and were now forced to march barefooted. Before long, John realized this conflict was little more than a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Unbeknownst to John, back home Arlene had given birth to their first child, a little girl named Julia. The first time he learned of her existence was on September 27, 1862, when he received a letter stating that his 7-month-old daughter had died from diphtheria. That was a heartbreaking point for John. He simply picked up his gun, dusted himself off, quit fighting, and walked back to his cabin on Groundhog Mountain. For the next 3 years, John was deemed a deserter, and he had to hide out in a cave near his home. Each day, Arlene would secretly bring him food. Finally, in 1865, after the Civil War ended, John was able to return to Arlene. Within a few months, Arlene was pregnant with her second child, but sadly, the baby boy was stillborn at birth. Giving birth to a child without any medical care during the pregnancy or birth resulted in a high mortality rate back then. Yet what happens next remains unexplained. In 1868, Orlene Pucket gave birth to her third child, another son, who was once again stillborn. By now, John and Arlene had dug 3 of their own children's graves and started their own personal graveyard just a few hundred feet from their cabin. Between the years of 1861 and 1882, Orlene Pucket had 5 miscarriages and gave birth to 19 children, none of whom lived more than a few months. Now she had a graveyard next to her cabin with 24 children. Mountain folks who lived in the area were suspicious. Whispers and rumors swirled that perhaps the would-be mother had intentionally killed their children. Others floated rumors that perhaps John was involved. However, modern medical theory suggests it might have been an underlying medical condition. There was no way for them to know back then that if a mother's blood was Rh negative and a father's blood was Rh positive, the mother's antibodies would attack the babies she carried. After Arlene's first baby was born, she likely developed antibodies against all her future babies' blood types, and thereby each time the pregnancy was doomed. By now, Arlene's body was worn out and she was no longer able to conceive. Heartbroken, she did the best she could to go about the daily grind of raising chickens and sheep and keeping a spotless house, but her life would soon change. In 1889, a neighbor came running to the Pucket farm in desperation. His wife was in the throes of labor, but there was no medical doctor who would arrive in time. Arlene rushed to the side of the pregnant woman, and at 50 years old, in the dim light of a flickering candle, Orlene Pucket delivered her first baby. To see that child live and to hold the newborn in her arms must have been medicine for Arlene's aching soul. That night unlocked something deep inside of her. Orlene Pucket was about to become one of the most legendary granny doctors in American history. John bought his wife a leather satchel, which she filled with tools for childbirth. Orlene Pucket could be seen in her black dress and bonnet, riding side saddle on her white mule named Rosie, all over Patrick and Carroll County to deliver newborns. Even in the winter, she was said to have driven nails through the soles of her shoes to keep from slipping on ice. She was known to ride as far as 20 miles away to help. Her midwifery record was remarkable. She never lost a single mother or baby. Folks began calling her Aunt Arlene, and to her, every baby she delivered was a miracle of God. In 1938, at the age of 99 years old, Aunt Arlene successfully delivered her last baby. Over the span of half a century, the woman who had lost 24 of her own children had successfully delivered over 1,000 healthy babies. Aunt Arlene's health began failing in 1938. The world around her was changing, and the Blue Ridge Pathway was being built through the mountains. Using eminent domain, the government began seizing land, and in 1939 they told Arlene that her property was needed. The 100-year-old mountain woman was defiant and refused to sell, but they gave her 30 days to evacuate. It is a tragedy that the woman who brought so much joy to others was forced out of her home by the government. At 100 years old, too weak to even walk, her family had to carry her out of her home while she was still sitting in her favorite rocking chair. She died just a few weeks later, in October of 1939. In 2012, the state of Virginia named Orlene Pucket, the mountain doctor who delivered over 1,000 babies yet couldn't spell her own name, as one of the 100 most important women who had ever lived in the history of Virginia. As for her property, the Blue Ridge Pathway runs right through it. At mile marker 189.9, a small cabin still stands in her memory. What a woman!